Hello there. I want to welcome you to Old Testament 101. And today is class number 1. We're going to be doing an overview of both Genesis and the book of Exodus. And so we want to get into this right away. Our hope is by the time we're done with this class, you will have an overall picture of the Old Testament and what that looks like. And so as we do that, we're excited that you are a part of this class. So let's jump in, and we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 1 here. And Genesis is the first book in the 5 books of the Bible called the Pentateuch. And so in the Pentateuch, we have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And Pentateuch means 5 books. And so they believe that these books cover the time basically from creation to the death of Moses, somewhere around 1405 BC. This section is called the Law, and the Law refers to the books that have been written by Moses, but there's also a lot of history within these books. And so these books describe the beginning of the world, the beginning of God's covenant people with Israel. And that theme is going to continue to show itself throughout the whole Old Testament. And so covenant is going to be a big word in what we talk about. And so the word Genesis, or the title Genesis, simply means beginnings. And so when you think of Genesis, it teaches us the beginnings of how our world got started. We're introduced to things like sin. We learn about the creation of people. And then also we learn how God is going to deal with his people through covenants. And so in the first covenant, or not the first covenant, but the covenant that we see God working with his people will be with Abraham. And so we want to talk a little bit about the authorship and also the date. So many scholars believe that Moses is the author of Genesis. And so there are different accounts within Genesis that, or within different books of the Bible, Old Testament, that kind of refer to Moses, or at least lean that way. I'm not so concerned. I know there's some scholarly debate that maybe others wrote it, especially when you get into the book of Deuteronomy, where Moses dies, that his, it's written in there that he dies. And so how did he write that? And so our concern so much for this course is not necessarily whether to prove or disprove Moses, but to simply be able to kind of understand the book. And so we think that Genesis was probably written then sometime around maybe 1402 BC. So some of the purpose and themes of this book is that Genesis' purpose is really to tell us the history behind God's covenant with his chosen people, Israel. And so many people believe that during the time of captivity, when the Israelites were in captivity to Babylon, that the book of Genesis became very important. There are some who believe that possibly Genesis was written during the captivity, and there might be some evidence towards that, as they lived in a culture where other people were flouting their gods and how their gods created the world. And so the Israelite people also wanted to share that story of how their God had created the world. And so, but again, the thing that we want to remember is that Genesis tells the history behind God's covenant and his chosen people, Israel. There's some themes of Genesis that have to do with beginnings. There's the beginning where he created the world, the beginning of the human race, the beginning of the nations of the earth, the beginning of the covenant between God and his people through Abraham. And some things that are important. A covenant is an agreement between two parties that usually require action from one or both parties. And so God put a covenant into action between himself and Abraham. These were the everlasting promises that God said that he would perform his covenant with Abraham. And I want us to know that the covenant of Abraham is a very critical covenant because it becomes the promise of God wanting to bless the world, and that covenant is going to come to fruition or fulfillment in Jesus. And so really this covenant that he gives to Abraham, it is something that again permeates the whole Old Testament, but also the New Testament as well, as they take on those promises. It's in that covenant God's going to create a great nation through Abraham. And the covenant where we learn that God was going to bless Abraham along with his life. And not only that God was going to bless Abraham, but God was going to bless those who were a blessing to Abraham. And ultimately, we see in the church that those who blessed the descendants of Abraham were blessed. Those who cursed were cursed. And all the families of the earth would be blessed through Abraham, which fits well into the promises of what Jesus does. As Jesus fulfills those promises of this blessing, Jesus then becomes a blessing to the whole world. The covenant with Abraham extended beyond his own life, and that's important to know that God, when you read stories in the Old Testament, especially when you read in Genesis, and you think about these stories, that God would spend thousands of years being faithful to this promise. So it's important that God's covenant promises were unconditional. In other words, it wasn't based upon what the people would do. In other words, if God said that he was going to bless the world, that even when Israel was not a blessing, which many times they were not, when Israel was not a blessing, God was still faithful to his covenant. And so that is an important thing to know. Genesis is structured in two main parts. First of all, we have the history before the covenant people. These are the events basically that take shape from Genesis chapter 1 to through Genesis chapter 11. And we have in there God's creation of the universe, Adam and Eve's fall into sin, God's judgment through the great flood. God overcomes the pride of the people at the Tower of Babel. And then from Genesis, late Genesis 11, all the way through the rest of the book, we have the history of the covenant people as God begins to form this people that are to be on mission for a special task within the world. We're going to learn that that this group, this family, even though they've been sent on this special task, really don't do a good job of this. But again, remember, God is faithful. So God is going to complete his mission. So these covenant people, we know them as the patriarchs. These were the patriarchs of Israel. They're founders of the different tribes. So we have, Israel counted Abraham as its founder. So, when we think, even as a Christian people, we recognize that we are children of Abraham. Now, since most of us are not Jews, we are his children through adoption, and that adoption comes through Jesus Christ. And so then Abraham's son Isaac and grandson Jacob, and they begin to possess the land of Canaan that God had promised. Um, and so then the story moves towards near the end of Genesis. The story moves towards Joseph living in Egypt. And then we believe that then God would continue his covenant with his people there. The historical background of the book, Genesis, was written somewhere around the 15th century BC. I know there are others who believe that it may have been written at other times, but again, I'm more concerned that the book is an authentic book. And so the development of the message in Genesis, Genesis introduces main sections of the book with a phrase. And you'll see this throughout Genesis. This is the history, or these are the generations. And so there are 12 such places in Genesis. You have the notes there and the quotes where you can find those, but there's the creation, the heavens and the earth, right? This is the history. This is the story of how things began. The book of Adam and Noah, the sons of Noah, we begin to learn about how God is working through history, how he uses Noah and his sons and their families, then Terah, who's the father of Abraham, Ishmael, who is Abraham's son, and we begin to learn about him. And what we begin to see that Genesis really, even though it follows this one family of Abraham, we begin to learn how the other nations came about. Ishmael becomes the father of certain nations, and just as Isaac becomes the father of the Jewish people, and Abraham does, but then you have Esau. Esau becomes the father of the Edomites, and then Jacob becomes the father of the Jewish 12 tribes. And notice that this list begins with a very broad focus of all of creation and narrows its focus as it continues, ending on the people of the covenant. And so it's not that Ishmael and Esau and their descendants and the tribes that they are part of, it's not that they're not important in history or God doesn't love them, but God is going to choose a certain way to restore the world. And so that's an important thing too to pick up in Genesis, that when God created the heavens and the earth, he said that it was good. And when sin enters in the world, it disrupts that goodness. But God is wanting to restore the heavens and the earth. And so after everything kind of falls apart after Genesis 3, the story of the Bible, and it begins in the Old Testament and it'll work its way all the way to Revelation. The story of the Bible is to renew and restore what has gone bad. And so what's going to happen is that even though there are other people groups that God loves, the story of the Bible is going to stay focused on the covenant people, the ones who are going to bring this renewal, the ones who are going to bless all the nations. See, God wants to bless all the nations. And so it's not just about Israel. And Israel isn't a special nation because that somehow they're better than everybody else. They simply have been set apart to do a certain work. So some theological ideas within the book of Genesis: everything exists because of God. We learned that God created mankind in his image. So mankind's not physical because God is spirit. And this means that the image of God is in mankind, is moral, intellectual, and spiritual. And so when God breathed into mankind, when he breathed into man and brought Adam and Eve into the world, they had something the rest of creation didn't have, and that was the image of God on them. And so they were able to choose and make decisions. The animal kingdom is based upon instinct. So It doesn't have the thinking process that humans have, but that thinking process and the intellectual and the ability to reason and to say and do moral things are based upon the image of God on us. And so the fall of Adam and Eve opened the way for sin to control people. In the garden, God just wanted us to simply trust him. But what happened is that in the garden, we decided not to trust him. And so sin, sin now becomes very apparent within the story. We also, another theological theme is that God rules over the universe, and he has the power to bless and to curse according to mankind's obedience. And so sometimes we have this picture that God has left the world, but God continues to appear. Even after Genesis 3, he continues to appear. And so he hasn't left the world. He continues to stay in the world. God then makes himself known both in word and deed and to Israel's ancestors. And so we see God continue to work in Genesis, and we see him meeting with people, and he shares a covenant with Abraham, and God will take actions to protect his covenant people, and he'll work in a lot of different ways. You know, he protects Abraham and Sarah from destroying the opportunity to begin their family line. You know, if you remember as you read through Genesis, that Abraham and Sarah, they think that they can accomplish God's promise to them in ways that God doesn't necessarily want. And so God also protects Isaac and Rebekah from the anger of Abimelech and the Philistines. And he protects Jacob from the anger of Esau. Remember, Jacob, if you read through Genesis, Jacob is kind of a swindler. He's not a very good guy, and he cheats Esau out of his birthright. And so there's a lot of anger and resentment from that. But God protects Jacob. Again, not because Jacob's good, not because Jacob's this great guy, but because God is going to fulfill his covenant. And he protects Joseph from death as his brothers try to kill him. And then he puts Joseph in a place of power in Egypt. And so there's some different ways to preach Genesis. And so you can focus on God, the ruler, that he's the ruler of the universe, that everything exists because of God. And as a ruler, God expects people to obey him. As a creator, God loves and wants to bless us. You can preach Genesis, that God is faithful to his promises. I think that'd be a great series to do if you were to preach through Genesis, just all the promises that God makes, especially when his people are not too faithful. And so in this area, in your notes here, there's outlines of Genesis. And so this is for you to just to kind of get a grasp on, but this breaks down the book of Genesis, and so some good stuff to look at in this. So let's transition to Exodus now. Exodus continues the account of Genesis, right? So God has started this covenant relationship with Abraham and his people, and when we leave the end of Genesis, we have Joseph and Jacob taking his whole family into Egypt because there's a famine. And so when we get into Exodus, we realize that Exodus begins or continues the story, but we don't find the people in this wonderful land in Egypt prospering, but we actually see them in slavery. And so Joseph and Jacob's family, they all go into Egypt under friendly terms, but historically the Egyptians turn on them and they enslave them to the point where the Egyptians don't even remember the promises from the past. And so Exodus is the Greek title in this book. It means going out or exit. And so it tells us kind of the theme of the book. And so Exodus is the second of the five books that we've called the Pentateuch here. The books of the law. So again, author and date. The author right now, we're just going to say that the author is Moses. It was written probably between the time of the Exodus and maybe the final days of Moses. I suppose there might have been some other editors that helped in that as well. Let's talk about the purpose, themes, and structure. Okay, the purpose of Exodus is to connect and continue God's covenant with Abraham. Okay, so that's important. We don't want to forget that the purpose of Exodus, and we're going to see the covenant begin to work its way and continue through the different books of the Bible. Especially as we get deeper into the Old Testament, we'll begin to see this. So the theme for Exodus is Israel's change from being a captive people under Egypt. So we go from them being in captivity as slaves to they begin to live out under this covenant as a nation. And of course, we know there's a lot of problems that they have, and they end up, what should have just taken a short time, literally takes them almost 40 years before they enter into the promised land. And by the time it's said and done, all the adults will not go into the promised land, just the children, and as they grow up and become adults. The structure of Exodus is in two parts. There's God delivering his people from slavery in Egypt, and then there's God's covenant with Israel at Mount Sinai, and that plays a big part of the Bible. So in the historical background, talk about that for a moment. Exodus tells us about the final years, the 430 years that Israel spent in Egypt. It also records the covenant laws given to Israel through Moses at Mount Sinai. And so Exodus records about the first 80 years of Moses's life. Remember Moses, he was rescued as a baby, adopted into the house of Pharaoh. And so he grows up under privilege, under power. And then the second 40 years of Moses's life, we pick up on that part of his life where he goes out into the wilderness. Exodus also tells us about the 10 great plagues that God used to strike the Egyptians and convince Pharaoh to let Israel go. And so here's just kind of a chart of these different plagues. But if you remember, Pharaoh's heart was very stubborn, and so God used these plagues to move history along and to get Pharaoh to let the Israelite people go. Concerning the development of the message of Exodus can be developed from slavery to redemption, to revelation, to response. So slavery under Egypt. Genesis ended with Israel as Egypt's guest. Exodus begins with Israel as Egypt's slaves. Okay, and so that's important. So over time, there were so many Israelites in Egypt that Pharaoh ordered the Hebrew males killed at birth to control Israel's population. And that's where the story of Moses begins, that slavery, the Israelite people are in slavery. And so Moses' sister hides Moses as a baby in the Nile River in a basket, and Pharaoh's daughter rescues. And so that story begins to evolve. And when Moses was an adult, he saw an Egyptian guard, and he saw an Egyptian guard beating a Hebrew slave. And so Moses was so angry, he killed this guard. And so Pharaoh wanted Moses dead. And so Moses runs to Midian, and where he meets and marries his wife, Zipporah. He spends 40 years as a shepherd out there, and then God speaks to him from a burning bush, because God hears the cries of his people, and God is going to use Moses. Then there's the redemption from Egypt. Moses, goes to the court of Pharaoh to deliver God's command to let Israel go. Pharaoh refuses to listen and really is very hard on the Israelite people. Then God sends the plagues, and finally the 10th plague is the death of the firstborn. And Pharaoh finally lets Israel go. And of course, there's a major event in that where we have the Passover, where the death angel passes over the houses of those that have the lamb's blood on the doorpost. And of course, we as Christians today, we celebrate what we call the Lord's Supper, and the Lord's Supper originates from the Passover. And there's a lot of symbolism within that Passover event and the blood that Jesus is going to take on later. And so that's important. But God's people then leave Egypt. God is going to provide food and water and also military success, because as they're moving out into towards the promised land, there are other nations that are living there. And so that is important. Well, then another section is a revelation of the covenant. God's going to reveal much about himself. He's going to give laws so that the people might live under this new community. Again, remember, God is calling out a people to live in a new way. You know, back in Genesis, I didn't mention it really at all, but you know, the first 6 chapters of Genesis just shows the violence of the earth, and they seem to be doing just whatever they want. And so God calls out this chosen people, and he begins to set down these laws that they can't just do whatever they want, and death and destruction are not going to be a part of the community. And so this covenant is given to Moses, and we know, you know, the 10 commandments come out of this, but there's more than just the 10 commandments, but the commandments are given to our lives to help direct us. There are social laws that are given, how to explain how we live amongst one another. There's religious laws and how to do certain practices. And so these laws include instructions on building the tabernacle, which the tabernacle was where God's presence was at. It was a house of worship, in a sense, for them. And then we have another section within Exodus, a response to the covenant. And Israel's first response to the covenant was really not a good response, because they began to worship a golden calf. And so Moses has to plead with God to keep Israel as his people, and you know, because God's just ready to start over and wipe them out. But Moses pleads, and so God renews his covenant with Israel, and this time Israel chooses to obey the covenant, and God then fills the tabernacle with his glory. So some of the theology within Exodus, God is a savior and provider. You know, so we see God saving the infant Moses. God saves his people from slavery. God saves Israel from the Egyptian army. God provides the bread of life. God provides the water of life. So another theme, theological theme, is that God is the holy lawgiver, and we just see, you know, God gives the 10 commandments to give Israel basic principles on how to live life that would be pleasing to God. God gives instructions on living a holy life towards other people in the covenant, and then God gives instructions on holy living through worship and fellowship with him. So God blessed the completed tabernacle. We see that, and sometimes the tent of meeting. So uniqueness, how to preach this book. Moses is a unique person in the Bible. Time and time again, by faith, he chooses God's way over what seemed to be easier or more comfortable. Moses wasn't perfect, right? So those are some things that you can talk about, that Moses, even though he was faithful, he was not perfect, but he would get back right with God. And so he would lead Israel to keep the Passover, and Moses was one who choosing by faith to pass through the Red Sea. He gave instructions. Another theme is God's basic rules for living, right? Or the 10 Commandments. And so, you know, the 10 Commandments would be great, something to preach. There's two groups of the commandments. There's the first group is relating to God, you know, only trust God, only worship God, use God's name only to honor him, use the Sabbath to rest and honor God. And then the second group of the commandments is, you know, honor your parents. This is the commandments relating to people. Honor your parents. Don't murder one another, right? Be faithful to your husband or wife. Do not steal. Do not lie, and be content with what God has given you. So as you preach, help people understand God's laws and purposes. The law is given to guide us through our lives. The law reveals God's holiness, and it reveals where we're short, our sin. The law tells us how to best relate to both God and other people. So here we have just some outlines of Exodus, and just kind of a breakdown, just like we did in Genesis. This kind of gives you a breakdown of what Exodus looks like. And so anyhow, that is the books of Genesis and Exodus. And I am excited that that we get to talk about these books. And so that's an overview of the books. Make sure to read your lesson, and then as we meet in class, we will begin to discuss more of this book. So anyways, again, this is Old Testament 101, and today was our review over Genesis and the book of Exodus. Have a great day, class.